Hi everyone, and welcome to our continuing series of grape overviews of wines and vineyard land that we produce for Prima Materia. I'm Pietro, I'm owner, winemaker, and viticulturist at Prima Materia. Our tasting room is in Oakland, but our vineyard is up in Lake County, just north of Napa. Quick blurb about the location. Lake County is basically a continuation of Napa Valley, should be right down here. Mayacamas mountain range on one side, the Vaca range on another side, and we have a third factor where we are. We're right at the foot of an extinct, well actually it's a high-risk volcano called Mount Canocti, about 2 miles away. So we actually have three different altitude elements at work and affecting our soils there. Kind of think of it as a continuation of the Calistoga AVA, just about 40 miles north in the next county. And today though I want to talk about Sangiovese. Sangiovese is a complicated grape, a lot of history, probably my desert island red grape if I could pick only one. For me, it's a lot like a more robust Pinot, not on the heavy Cabernet side of the spectrum at all, and something where finesse and power can line up in really beautiful ways. Sangiovese, documented back to the 1700s. It's related to a couple other grapes in Italy. Neoluccio, which you might see from Sardinia, is clearly a parent of some sort. Cilieggiolo is another one that's related to Sangiovese, but not sure if it's a parent or an offspring. And interestingly enough, Sangiovese shares a lot of DNA with local non-vinifera grapevines growing along streams in Tuscany as well. A lot of little alleles shared between these things. So its actual origin and who's the father, who's the mother, who's the child, still a lot of work to be done on Sangiovese. It is the most planted grape in Italy, which attests on the one hand to its quality, but on the other hand, they can be very expensive and they can be very bad. And unfortunately, a lot of people's first experience is trying a cheap Chianti, maybe in a straw basket, kind of a fun thing, or at the local red gravy joint, and it's not so good. Sangiovese can be very high in acidity, very shrill, and it requires a lot of work in the vineyard to really bring out its best. So a lot of that cheaper production Sangiovese in Italy is pretty forgettable, or you might remember it for the wrong reasons actually. But great Chianti Classicos, Brunello, certainly if you've ever heard of that, that's sort of the top of the Sangiovese ladder. But there are other regions also, Vino Nobile di Montepulciano. If Sangiovese has a little bit too much tannin for you normally, there's even an area called Morellino to the south, and their type of Sangiovese is larger, but with a lot less tannin and lower acidity. It's a little more on that not Merlot, because that's wrong, but it's a smoother, rounder expression of Sangiovese. One thing about Sangiovese is that there are hundreds of clones. I think right now Italy has maybe 120 listed, and more being found in vineyards and cultured all the time. So big berries, small berries, canopies can be very different. We have 4 different types planted in our vineyard, and they, while all being Sangiovese and sharing some similarities, the Prunello Gentile is radically different from the Romagnolo and different from the Brunello. The first storied Brunello producer, Biondi Santi, we have one of the clones that they grow on their famous vineyard as well, and that one is very different than the other ones too, much slower growing. The vines even look different. The inner nodes are very elongated. A lot of tannin in that grape, which is one of the things I love about Sangiovese. It's extremely textural, and I'm a texture guy. I guess being ex-chef, pretty much any of the grapes that I make wines out of that have tannin, they kind of go for me to a much more deeper textural focus than just worrying about fruit and acidity, and Sangiovese is definitely one of those things. Sangiovese came to California first around 1870. Agustin Harristy brought it into Buena Vista in Sonoma County. Back then it was called Sangioveto a lot, and you can still find that on a couple Italian labels. They'll say Sangioveto. Nothing really happened with those plantings though. They sort of fizzled. Later, the Italian-Swiss colony outside of Cloverdale became the largest producer, and there was a good amount of Sangiovese in their Tipo Chianti, which is pretty famous, California's first sort of Tuscan-styled wine, which is interesting. They, like most large wineries, they acquired thousands and thousands of acres, their production shifted. They were also growing Barbera, Nebbiolo, Mourvèdre, Pinot Grigio, lots of different grapes, but things were often all just going into one jug blend. So it's hard to estimate what the actual acreage and volume of Sangiovese was in there. In great vintages, you could find bottlings of Nebbiolo and Barbera in the early 1890s. So I wouldn't be surprised if there were lots that were separated out, but you got to remember back then things were white or red. They were wines of type, not wines of varietal. So the business focus was a little bit different. But historically very, very important that Italian-Swiss colony focused on Sangiovese. And the one interesting link to that that's still in production today is Seghezio in Healdsburg, famous for those infidels. Eduardo Seghezio was one of the winemakers for Italian-Swiss colony way back 1900. And some of the Sangiovese that I think goes into their Venom bottling is cuttings that the Italian-Swiss colony had planted 120, 130 years ago. So there are a couple types out there in the field that are part of that bottling that are genetically from those original types. So very interesting little bit of historical wrap up there. So glad something is preserved from that. We tend to lose a lot of things as replanting occurs and the market shifts and different things happen. Then of course, Prohibition. Nobody was really focusing on Chichi grapes for a while. I think Montevina up near Amador, El Dorado foothills, was the first to sort of replant Sangiovese, early 70s, maybe 71. Caparone also, I think, planted it in 1980 down in Paso as well. A couple other plantings here and there, little bits in Amador. With the California story, though, what's interesting is that in the late 1990s, a big push. Calatal wines became a thing, and up at Atlas Peak was one of the biggest, or the biggest, definitely the biggest Sangiovese project in California. Big money, couple distilleries, famous producer from Italy. Mondavi was involved and started his own line of Italian wines, I think called La Famiglia di Mondavi, which were not very good and shut down pretty promptly. So Mondavi was a great marketer. His interest in actual wine quality was questionable. But in the late 1990s, you had this sudden explosion of Napa Valley Sangiovese, and it was priced very high. Some of the vineyard choices were very strange. Some of the clonal choices were very strange. You had very expensive bottles that were panned in the press. Back then, an $85 of Napa Valley bottle of Sangiovese that gets terrible reviews and is over-oaked and thin and weak and all of that, that just didn't play very well. And then, to counteract that, they started... Other things can do well up there. It's a very interesting area up on Atlas Peak, but they started blending in lots of Cabernet into the Sangiovese, and then Sangiovese does not play well with French grapes, so then the style shifted, and basically, even today, you'll still hear people say, I hate Calatals, no California Sangiovese for me. It's sort of tarred and feathered everything that people like me are trying to do today. So, thanks guys. Sangiovese's history is interesting though, because it was always a grape that was blended with a little bit. Normally 70%, 80% in a blend. But it's a grape that can sometimes use some fill-in from other ones. And even in some areas, they were blending it with white grapes, Trebbiano and some of the Malvasias. There are Colorino, Mamolo. You'll still find those in some of the blends. They can actually work well with Sangiovese. If anything, they can sometimes amp up the Sangiovese-ness. But personally, I find that even a couple percent Cabernet or Merlot, or even Cab Franc, I've had a couple with a little bit of Cab Franc in it. They're okay because they bring up the spice element, but Cabernet just destroys Sangiovese. And Sangiovese is an oak sponge. If you start putting it into little barrels or barriques, it it sucks it up like no other grape I can think of. Something like Cabernet doesn't care. Cabernet says, what else you got? Pinot relies a little bit on oak in some ways, depending on the style you're making, and it kind of dovetails well. Sangiovese just, especially for California Sangiovese, I just think it's the wrong thing to do. So all neutral oak for us. Historically, though, Sangiovese is challenging. It's very productive. It makes huge crop if you're not out there really working with the vines constantly. They're extremely vigorous. Fruit can be overshaded, undershaded. And then you have all the clonal differences, too. If it rains too much, huge bunches, just screaming high acidity, very not charming. Like Barbera can always be kind of grapey and fun, but Sangiovese, it can just be downright yucky if it's not constantly tended to. So, but in its best expressions, it's an amazing, amazing grape, and the one I drink the most. I'll just put it that way. What else can I say about it? Comparing it to Pinot, though, I want to get back to that. It's a lighter bodied grape, so don't approach Sangiovese expecting dark wine, and if you find one, something's wrong with it, or it's been blended, and as long as people are clear about that. But it's a lighter bodied thing. It's for Pinot people who wish Pinot had a little more acid and a little more tannin. Aged Sangiovese can be beautiful. When young, you can make nice glue out of Sangiovese. Very strawberry, the cherry spectrum from lighter, brighter red to like dark, stewed cherries. Usually some pepper. As Sangiovese ages, it gets this really cool, like mentholated leather, actually not mentholated, like pine needle, spicy pine, resin, whereas good Burgundy gets a little bit stinky and has some interesting things on the funkier spectrum. I find that aged Sangiovese, comparable to Burgundy, similar age, develops these high tones that go across. It's almost like if you took an aged Mourvèdre and then added some forest notes to it. Really, really cool stuff, and I'm happy to see that our 2014, our first real vintage estate grown, is actually starting to develop some of that pine sol and leather on top of all the red cherry, black cherry, all the nice fruit below it. And Sangiovese has plenty of fruit, so it can take some structure. For me, Sangiovese should always have nervous tannin. Even if it's 15 years old, it should be wound tight. It's sort of an angry, slightly misguided young man of a wine, but also with a very soft artistic side. Not soft, very refined artistic side. Sangiovese always has a firmness to it, so that may put some of the more delicate Pinot drinkers off. The people with patches on their sleeves. When Sangiovese was being investigated in California, one of the things that was clear was that it was a Zone 3 grape. It doesn't like it too cold. It doesn't like it too hot. In the last video, we talked about Barbera. Barbera was the opposite. Huge range of possibilities. When we get to Refosco, another one we make, we'll talk about that. That was something that could go from Zone 1 to Zone 4. But even Hilgard in the late 1880s doing all the tests and test plantings all over the state, it was clear that Sangiovese is kind of particular. It likes altitude. It's friendly with clay soil, which where we're at in Lake County is actually kind of a good mix. Like 30% clay, 30% rock, 30% volcanic sand, and then other stuff in there. It's a good match for Sangiovese, as long as it doesn't get too smoking hot. That's one of the reasons I think it's actually going well up there, is the soil mixes are correct. It can take some heat, but it's not something you're going to see in hot regions of Paso. Then it just kind of cooks out and loses all that finesse at its core. But you do have all these clonal choices, rootstock choices. Do you have water? Can you irrigate? Does it get cold at night? What are the winds like? Are you close to the ocean? There are all these other mitigating factors that can really make a beautiful Sangiovese that echoes the old world with a little bit of the California fruit-forward identity, which in most places we just can't get around. That's just how it is. As far as winemaking goes, this is probably the most Burgundian of the wines I make, which I would say slow, spontaneous fermentations. I like some whole cluster in here. Not a huge amount, but like 20%, 25%. Amp up the tannin, kind of constrain the fruit a little bit. Get some bramble and spice in there rather than using oak, which is a whole different kind of thing. And you've got some acid too, so that little bit of potassium, it leaches out of the stems. You can still have an acid forward grape, but you get more textural on the back end. You start really playing with those. I think I mentioned we have 5 different vineyard blocks, 4 different types planted, and I harvest all those separately. So Brunello clones, gonna harvest later, more tannin, big. I will probably take those temperatures higher, may go extended, maybe a little more Cabernet-ish. Our Prugnola Gentile is very floral, very pretty at lower bricks. Skins are very thin. Even the color of the grape's quite different, even though it's still Sangiovese. That would be a very cool fermentation for those bright floral notes. And then we have some Romagnolo types also, which are sort of in the middle, a little bit of blue fruit to those. There's a lot of Sangiovese planted in Emilia-Romagna, and actually a lot of people think those are the better clones of the selections, but the winemaking isn't quite to Tuscan precision. You know, it's Lambrusco country. Great wine on its own. We'll do a video on that too, because I've been drinking a lot of Lambrusco lately. But yeah, the world of Sangiovese can be a lot like the world of Pinot, talking about, you know, Pommard versus all the other clone types, how they ripen, the climate, the soil, the roots. And cellar practices, I think, work very well with it in a similar way. Some of the more robust grapes like Sagrantino will treat very differently, but Sangiovese it always has this core of elegance to it that you're going for, but in sort of a wiry, kind of slightly muscular frame. So I really love it. What else should I say? In California, it has been probably the grape I've been most disappointed with. There are a few producers I could mention who I think are doing a good job with it, and usually they're people who are a little more restrained in their approach. But Sangiovese is so vineyard driven that you have to be really careful with it. If you don't get something grown specifically in a particular way, then there's no way you're going to get, you know, beautiful aged Chianti Classico style wine out of it. It's very particular. It certainly has taken me, this will be my 10th vintage with it, and I feel like I'm just starting to get my head around the grapes. Plus, it's slow maturing. For being a thin-skinned grape that's not particularly dark or robust, you can do a lot of really extended aging with Sangiovese. It's quite hardy. Brunello, of course, being the most famous example. But years in barrel, how much oxygen are you metering in? Do you want to try to soften those tannins? For me, no. I want some grip on there. It's where it hits your palate, where it melts, keeping it off the gums. Do you incorporate some of the lees in there? Those are all the more fine-grained questions that we start dealing with the Sangiovese. So this is also one of our core grapes. So we have, this is our second most planted grape. The Barbera is the most. So try to keep these bottles affordable also, $28. 24 months in oak. So it's not a short-term turn and burn kind of bottling as well. This is built to age, and every time I check in on past vintages, I've been pretty happy with where they're going. So I think we'll do Refosco next. Hope you're enjoying these series. If you're ever in Oakland, please come visit, especially once we open. Still waiting to hear when Alameda County is going to do that. But everything's available on the website, and if you're in the Bay Area, I am delivering 4 bottles equals free delivery. So see you out there. Thank you.